You everyone. I'm so excited to see the group of people that we have here today. I started out at APD, so developmental disabilities was my background. I worked in headquarters doing training for providers, particular waiver support coordinators and general revenue support coordinators. And now I've transitioned over in particular with dealing with public guardianship in the state. And we have statewide coverage of public guardians. Karen is actually the public guardian for the entire North Florida area, pretty much from Panama City to Jacksonville and everything in between and everything south. And one of our primary goals is to educate people about alternatives. And you keep hearing the word alternatives coming up, because guardianship is intended to be used as a last resort. And because of maybe a lack of education in the community, it's often used as a first option. And we see that in particular when we first started, and when guardianship, it's been changing and growing every year. It was originally intended for people with age-related disabilities. That's why we are housed within the Department of Elder Affairs. 20 years ago, it was for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. They were considered to have diminishing capacity. They were starting here and they were going to get worse and worse and worse as time went along. Now we see guardianships for people with mental health. We see guardianships for people with traumatic brain injury. We see guardianships used a lot for people with developmental disabilities. And so it was really exciting to become a part of this group. We started with Lighting the Way, and Lighting the Way was such a wonderful resource. The community was begging for it because really it's such a complicated process. You all know that when you're working with your students, you're tailoring things for each of their individual needs. Each person has different levels of capacity and the rights that they can exercise. But when we're talking about turning 18, there is that fear, and it's a legitimate fear from parents to say, oh my gosh, we've been working on these things, are we ready yet? I think that's part of the first question. Are we ready yet? Are we ready to go out and just let them handle it by themselves? So what we wanted to do is put together materials that said, we're not saying that you have to handle it by yourself. We're just saying that you might not need guardianship. And I'm going to talk to you all just briefly a little bit before I go into our materials about guardianship versus the alternatives. You all are probably pretty familiar, but in terms of guardianship, it's a very expensive process. It is absolutely necessary for people who need that level of assistance, and most of the time, I see it for people who've been abused, neglected, or exploited. If you have a really active and really empowering family, and then they're told to get guardianship, they often get caught off guard because they didn't realize, oh, my child now needs an attorney, and someone's got to pay for that. And then the guardian, statutorily, needs an attorney, and someone needs to pay for that. And then on top of that, we have to go to court. And every year we got to file accountings, we got to file inventories, we got to do that as long as this guardianship takes place. So people were coming to us and saying, oh my gosh, I wish I knew that maybe this wasn't what was best for our family. And how do we get out? And that's where Restoring Rights came from. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And the truth is, you now have to prove that this person is capable of exercising their rights to get out of a guardianship. So that's why it was so imperative to us to go ahead of time, to go to the teachers, to go to the families, and educate the community to say, before we start there, because it's so complicated to get out, let's start with everything else. Let's look at everything else first. And this is not even specific to people with disabilities. This is advanced directive planning. Things that when I got in this field and I was in my early 20s, I didn't even consider it. Now every single one of my friends has all their advanced directives set up. I don't care if they're 23 years old, their advanced directives are set up, their needs are on paper. It was a really great opportunity to look at what I'm doing and start that as a model. because you'll meet Sandy later, and just for full disclosure, he's my dad. So it's been a fun process to go through this. He's on the evaluation end, and I've been in more of the agency side of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the materials. I want to introduce them to you, and then I want to give you guys the opportunity to really interact with it and to get together in groups and see the materials and see the different sections and how we approached it. And I want to talk to you all about why we approached it the way that we did. So Karen has talked to you all. Sorry, I'll definitely go in and speak into the mic. Karen talked to you all about Lighting the Way. And Lighting the Way is absolutely fabulous because it is a very in-depth look at all the different alternatives. And it starts, when we're talking about alternatives, there are advanced directives. We're talking about healthcare surrogates, medical proxies, power of attorneys, those kind of things. But we also talk about alternatives for people with disabilities who might just need a little bit more assistance that you've never maybe even thought of as an alternative. So let's say that someone might need a little bit more assistance with financial planning. We talk about special needs trusts, but we also talk about, have you guys tried doing a joint banking account? Do you have a TrueLink card? I thought I saw a TrueLink card. There's cards, a company that makes credit cards specifically to assist people with disability in managing their money on a credit card. There's all of these different resources that are out there that are alternatives to guardianship. So it says, okay, maybe this student only needs help with the medical side. They have a really exhaustive medical side. And the first thing we suggest is maybe talk to the student and see if they just want to extend out a hand and say, Mom, Dad, sister, pastor, would you like to help me? Right? The fear is the first thing that kicks in, and understandably so. But a lot of times, and we call it supported decision making, is if you have someone who is really willing to accept help if it's needed, then you might not need any alternatives other than that. You might just need someone who says, you know, how comfortable do you feel going to the doctor by yourself? It's a little uncomfortable. Doctor, don't always feel comfortable answering questions. Maybe you want to see if your mom still wants to go. You don't have to take her. I know that you're 18, but you know, maybe it will make you feel better to have a second set of eyes there. So an alternative could be nothing at all, right? So I think the key, and Amanda hit on this in particular, is really you spend all these years tailoring to these students, and in terms of legal rights, it's a really important time to tailor and see the needs. What level of needs does this person need? And really, you're going down that list of delegable rights. When you hit things like guardianship and you get a plenary guardianship and now that person doesn't have the right to vote and that person doesn't have the right to employment of their own free will, it's very restrictive. So what we did was, Lighting the Way is going to be really useful for a lot of your students. But we were funded to look at restoration of capacity. So people who are already in a guardianship and now maybe it wasn't the appropriate setting. Maybe it was the appropriate setting for the time. And guardianship is not intended to be permanent. So a lot of times it is the appropriate setting for that time. We need to get them away from that exploiter. And they might not realize that they are being exploited by that person, and that guardian can come in and be their advocate. But now it's no longer necessary. We want to look at, how do we begin restoring rights? What is that process? How can we help people through that process? And we realized it's not even about restoring rights. That can be the end goal, and that's wonderful. But what it's really about, it's about building abilities. It's about building confidence. Whether you're in a guardianship, whether you're not. Whether you have alternatives in place, whether you're working towards restoration or you are never there. We wanted to make materials that empowered students and persons with disabilities and empowered their families and their support staff to be able to have this discussion and do a self-assessment and say, okay, these things have kind of been floating along as we are under the age of 18 and mom and dad have the right to make decisions until then. Now, let's open up this discussion. Let's learn about these things together and let me support you. So what we developed, and there's a third one, you'll see it on the list. We didn't, I don't think, provide it here. But what we have here is this big binder is the workbook. It's intended for students and people with disabilities, and it is almost entirely activity-based. So it starts with about me. Fill it out and talk about yourself. And we always loved that because a lot of times, especially with service providers, and you'll see it sometimes with service providers, it's really helpful to start with, let's talk about ourselves, things that we like, things that we need, things that we don't like, some of our goals. I know you all are probably familiar with PATH and MAPS and all those different goal identification activities. So we have some of that in here, but this is all targeted towards identifying where I'm at now as a student or a person with a disability and where I want to be. So it's really a wonderful, wonderful resource. We're so excited about it because it's an opportunity to tailor the needs based on a bit of an assessment that you can do with them, they can do for themselves. And then secondarily, we've developed a guide, and the guide is for the person who is assisting them. Maybe there isn't someone assisting them, but certainly this would be wonderful for teachers. We really encourage it for parents. We really encourage it for service providers so that they understand who is delegated what rights, if any at all, and how to discuss that. And that's really important. But at the center of it all, the person is supposed to be working to make decisions and being involved in the decision-making process. So there's a third piece, which is a legal guide, because believe you me, the legal community was not educated either. So they are often part of the problem. And I see a couple of attorneys back there nodding their heads. So the legal guide was targeted specifically towards judges and attorneys and clerk staff and paralegals and people who often were also the first to recommend guardianship because they did not realize that, especially in the world of developmental disabilities, that there was anything else that you could do. It was guardianship or guardian advocacy. That is what you need. And there was no understanding, even in that community, that maybe it's part of your process to come and help facilitate alternatives as well. So we have those three pieces. So what we're gonna actually look at is less of the guide and more of the workbook, because we figure, since this is what the students will be using, the guide is directional to supplement this material. So what we're going to look at is, if you want to open in your guide here, or your workbook, excuse me, to the table of contents, you can see the different sections that we've come up with. And what we're going to do is we're going to break you out into different groups based on the table of contents, and I'd love for you all to kind of see the material, and we're going to assign you all different sections. So one group will look at the self-advocacy section, and whoever gets that group is pretty lucky because we've talked a lot and got to see a lot about self-advocacy with Daniel here, and I know that self-advocacy is a focus for students with disabilities, but we're talking about circles of support, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. That's a big one. It's important that the students understand risk factors, things to be on the lookout for, internet stuff, a lot of internet stuff, a lot of those ghost phone calls that everyone can fall for, really. And if it happens, what do I do? What's my role? What's my responsibility as a person who might have been put in that situation? We'll have another group look at legal status. it's going to be about identifying where that person is right now. For most of you all, that's going to be that their parent currently has the right to make those decisions until they turn 18. But then it's about saying, okay, let's look at each of these as individual things, not my legal rights. We don't have to have one thing in place, right? Maybe I just need help with money management, and if you ask my dad who walked back in the room, he'll absolutely tell you yes. So my husband would tell you the same thing. I certainly need help with money management. And then we're going to have one group look at the section 3, which is developing abilities by civil right. We broke down each of those delegable rights, and we gave suggestions. First and foremost, we gave a definition, because I remember the first time I read right to choose residential setting took me a second, so I have no idea what that means. Oh, it means right to choose where you live. So the first thing that we did was break it down and give everyone a definition. Then about where am I at now? Some activities if I'm interested in learning more about it. So especially, we'll see that a lot with students who are really looking forward to driving. Driving is a big one, voting is a big one. So we took and said, here's some different activities that you might want to consider. Feel free to find your own, which is why we put it in a workbook, so that they could keep their progress notes in one place, so that they could do a checklist and say, these are the things that I've done and that I've worked on. And the last piece is, if I don't currently have this right, what can I do to start the process in getting this right back? Because in Florida, we're considered really progressive in guardianship world, because we have limited guardianships, where you can have a guardian who's just over a couple of those rights. In adjacent states around us, it's not that way. You either have all your rights or you have none of your rights. And when all of your rights are stripped away, the only way you can get them back is proving that you can do every single thing. And I've yet to meet a person, maybe our APD provider aside, who can prove that they can navigate applying for governmental benefits. Because
I can just help you keep them.
that's right, because that's one of them. It's applying for governmental benefits. Whoosh. I don't know how I'm going to be able to prove that I can do that. So what we did was we broke each one of these down. Then I'm going to ask that group to just pick one. Pick any of the ones that you might be interested in. Right to marry is a really interesting one. When we put this group together, we had a parent advocate whose daughter went through the school system and the transitions process, met a wonderful young man, and got married. And so she talked a lot in some of the other workshops we did about that component and that fear, and preparing and helping that person get prepared for what it means to get married, what the responsibilities are, how to work through that. So there's a couple of different interesting ones that you might want to look at if you get in this group. But really what we want to do is just get this materials out to you all as an option to give out to your students, to give out to the parents, to start that process, to start talking. So even if your students are under 18, it's wonderful. I heard you talking about what your school system is doing, and while 17 is the requirement, we really would love it to be much earlier, right? 13, 14 to start talking about this and getting them prepared and having these discussions. So I'm going to break you all out into groups, and after a few minutes, we'll kind of get back together and report back on what you all found from the materials. Did you find it useful? What are some of the pieces that you really liked? We have some activities in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break you up kind of by tables of 2, if that works. So we're going to do these 2 tables. Will give you the very first section, which is going to be self-advocacy. These 2 tables, and if you have sparse people, your tables will sprinkle some of us in there too. So these 2 tables, you're going to look at building your circles of support, which is those keywords that the guardianship community likes to use also, talking about the people who you want in your circle of support and those that maybe the student needs to be aware of. The next 2 tables, so we're starting those 2 right here, we're going to look at protecting yourself against abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Yes. And these 2 tables, we're going to look at your legal status And if you all get through it quickly, you can look at whatever other sections you want to. And then, let's see, sorry, I'm gonna peel away from the mic, Eddie.
That's fine.
Okay, so first two, second two, all right. And then we're gonna let you all work on the different civil rights. Maybe you want to do 2 or 3 or so, since there's a bunch of different ones. If you want to just pick one and start looking at that as a group, we figured that would be a whole lot easier than putting all one and then we'll get back together in a few minutes and see what you think of the materials and how they work. This is really exciting to expand it out into the education sphere because you all have so much contact with them prior to the point when they need to make these decisions that it's so exciting to learn from your experiences, and hearing you all talk and the resources that you all have are things I have never heard of. And being in the guardianship sphere for years, we'd never heard of some of this stuff. I remember when people were bringing up bees, and I said, that sounds scary. I think they sting. I run from bees. I'd never heard of what bees was. So it's connecting all of these different groups that might have not connected before.
How about those musicians called fiddlers?
Ah, the fiddlers, yes.
Really great musicians.
Yes, bees, fiddlers, yeah. Fiddlers. I was like, oh, your acronyms and names are so positive and uplifting compared to the guardianship stuff. Sounds really aggressive and angry. So, I hope you guys got some time to interact with the materials. I think we'll just start with the first group over here. And we have a mic, Eddie? So talk a little bit about some of your takeaways. What did you think? What was the section that you all were assigned? And of course, I didn't write it down. Don't have it sitting in front of me.
Who's going to speak? Who's speaking on behalf?
Anyone want to speak? I know we're kind of putting you on the spot.
We were looking at Is it on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We were looking at self-advocacy, and
Okay.
my Maisie over here, what a beautiful name. We talked about several of our students that do not even know this concept.
Yeah.
And how powerful this will be and I feel like for all of our students, disabilities or not, because we have a lot of uneducated parents and students, for that matter, on this subject. And we are going to have some come to Jesus meetings with some of our family members.
That's great.
And secondly, we also decided that we must take this back to our communities. We both live in rural areas, and our people there are not educated in a lot of these tools that we have for our students nowadays. I think they look at one aspect of it, but there are so many other aspects that we need to kind of address
Right.
in these areas, and we're going to go back and educate our community as well, the entire community.
Oh, that's wonderful. You're spot on, because we did one of our trainings in a rural area and with one of the rural schools, and we were doing some examples. I was talking about, when we're looking for a place to live, right? We're trying to find a place to live, and we want to make sure it's a close vicinity for if we need to catch a bus. And I look over, and that teacher is just dying. She is laughing, or just, how we commute, can we get here by bus? And she goes, they've never been, for them, the only bus in this whole city is a school bus, so they don't know what you're talking about. So it's really, really tailoring to your students, and I'm so excited to hear that, because definitely community outreach is so much easier done on your level than on the agency level, which is where a lot of people are doing outreach. Is they want APD, they want Elder Affairs and Department of Ed and Voc Rehab to do these trainings, but you all are in that community and you know the resources better, so that's so exciting. I'm glad to hear it. All right, so who is the next group? Did I go down this way or that way? I can't quite remember. Okay. And which section did you all have?
We did building your circle of support.
Okay.
And just discussed about the importance of everyone being on the same page and,
Yes.
trusting, having that confidence, collaboration in each other. And kind of got off topic a little bit, just, it was on topic, but it was off topic, kind of referred to yesterday. As a teacher, I learned so much at yesterday's training about opportunities for college beyond high school that I was not aware of. So now I'm going to go back and be able to share all this information, and that community will build it even more and brought that to her attention now. So she has it to go on to.
That's wonderful. That's so exciting. And really, that was an interesting section because we always talk about building circles of support. And it was the first time that we realized that I would go to my dad here for almost anything in my circle of support, but my mom and I shouldn't be alone together when it comes to making decisions about spending our money in clothes and shopping. And realizing that we never thought, we always like, oh, here's my circle of support. It has, 15 people in it. But maybe the other person in my circle of support who isn't great with money shouldn't be my money circle of support. So it was a really interesting one on how to identify people in your circle of support who may or may not be someone you want in your circle of support, or who may be exploiters. We kind of put in a different section. But it was a really interesting area for us, asking the students to identify. But as teachers, now that you all have a lot of resources that you've developed or acquired over the years, things that you learned at this conference, new education-based resources, we can make those suggestions. We can help the students find these resources because, as you all know, they're everywhere. They're just impossible to find. They're not all in an easy, accessible place. So that's wonderful. So the next group, I think, is this group. Do we go?
I get to be the recorder everywhere I go. Okay. Our section was protecting yourself against abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and we thought this is an awesome section.
Great.
And it just basically, it breaks it down to the student very clearly, what the types of abuse and neglect and exploitation are, and what are some warning signs. And we really liked the scenarios.
Great.
Because it allows them to kind of think it through.
Yes.
Prior to it not happening, or prior to it hopefully never happening, but if they're in that situation, they get an opportunity to kind of think about it. We also liked the fact that they can kind of reflect to see if they, think about instances in which they may have been in those situations, and what did they take away, what did they learn so that it wouldn't happen again. An aha moment for us is we're also in a rural area, so we were thinking, when it came to the section about things that you should never give out, we thought most of our students probably don't know or don't have that information. And then we were even talking about a student who is 18 or will soon be 18, and he had dropped out of school, but we're not quite sure if the grandparents were kind of trying to get him back because of the check, because he didn't know bank numbers, because most likely that check was being deposited into the grandparents' account and things of that nature. So we were thinking sometimes our children are being exploited and abused by those caregivers that they are so very close to. So that was an aha moment for us.
Absolutely. Exploitation most often happens at home.
Yes.
Abuse most often happens at home. Contrary to a lot of news stories that you see, there's certainly exceptions. But the vast majority, we're not looking at, the door-to-door salesman coming and knocking on the door on a Sunday. You got to look starting in the house, and that's where we see a lot of it. And the abuse, neglect, and exploitation section was really crucial to us, because when we're talking about guardianship, that is the reason that people most often get in a guardianship. And this is true for people who are elderly as well. when we look at, and this is one of the scenarios that we like to give out to people when we go out there, and I do this for my staff who goes around and looks at the public guardian programs, just to put it in perspective. If we go to, the cops get called and someone starts filing the paperwork for guardianship for a man who's in his mid-80s, late 80s, let's say, because he burned the kitchen down. And so we asked them, what's your first question? And, everyone says the same kind of response. Does he have dementia? Does he have Alzheimer's? Does he know where he is? Is he safe? My first question is, who did the cooking? Did his wife just pass away, and his wife used to do all the cooking, and today, by gone it was the day he was going to learn to cook, right? So the key being that we want to stop perpetuating the cycle, especially in guardianship, of connecting a mistake to a consequence. Guardianship is a fantastic tool for people who absolutely need it. But one of the important sections that we also put in there is about why it's okay to make mistakes. And when we see a lot in the disability community is that they are held to a much higher standard because we want to make sure that they are safe and that they're not put into a situation. But that is no different from any other adult, no different from any other child. So having that section that says, you know what, it's okay. You can make a mistake. Bouncing a check, not going to kill you. I would venture to say that most of your students are probably never going to write a check, because I always joke with our team that is antiquated, that I don't own a checkbook. I don't think I have a checkbook. They all have debit cards, right? But overdrafting your account is not going to kill you. I am allowed to make bad decisions. I am allowed to, as an adult, overdraft my account. My dad, I certainly advise against it. But that section is really important. I'm glad that was a takeaway that you all got from there, was those scenarios. Those scenarios came from our group's experiences with the people that they either work with or their family members. The phone call scam where we get those a lot. The cell phone plans, going out to the mall, you don't have to spend any money, just sign right here, and you don't have to pay $1. I think Karen had a good one with a furniture thing or a computer or something, where they went out and said, you don't have to pay $1 for this computer right now, right? And so they went out and signed that contract. So making mistakes, but also being able to look at scenarios that every day are constantly changing and preparing them for it. That's great. So I think, we have my legal status, right? Is that the next one? Okay.
Oh, hello.
This was a complicated section a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, the activities themselves are very appropriate. The Your Legal Status section really breaks it down to whether or not the person with the disability makes their own decisions without help from others, or if somebody does make those decisions for them, or maybe they're not sure. So they go through and talk about the different ways in which somebody else might have that authority over them. So it could be where they themselves gave that authority, or it could be a situation where the court has given that authority, and knowing the differences between those and what kinds of documents that they themselves should be aware of, what they should have copies of, and things like that. And then they do an activity where they break it down into the civil rights that can actually which ones can be removed from the court, which ones can actually go to someone else where they have authority, and then which ones do not. And then the last section is where they talk about the rights that can never be taken away from those people with disabilities.
That's great. And this section is particularly interesting because originally it was very complicated to kind of lay it out. But when we went and trained, the very first thing that we asked the students in Amanda's class and the other classes were, who here makes all their decisions by themselves? And of course, nobody does. I confer with my husband on most decisions. Certain things I don't tell him because I have a shoe hobby. But I confer with my husband, I ask my parents, I work with them on, I have my circle of support. But of course, you can delegate rights to somebody, either the judge can do it, or the person themselves can say, you know what, I know that I need help with money management or making medical decisions. Let's do a power of attorney, or let's just do those things together. Let's do a joint banking account. And then, of course, there are the ones that can be taken away but cannot be exercised by someone else. For example, voting, right? The court can remove your right and say that you do not have the capacity to vote, but they can't delegate it to a guardian so that they get 2 votes. I've been trying to convince the court to let me get their right to travel so that I can have more travel days. But you can't, the right to marry, right? You can take that away but can't delegate it to somebody else. One of the complicated pieces of guardianship that you all will, I'm sure, are familiar with, if not, just to keep in mind, is guardianship is not about not being able to make that decision. It's about not having the capacity to understand what exercising that decision means. So, for example, you are allowed to make good or bad decisions with your money, and guardianship was not originally intended to be for people who made mistakes with money and now they need a guardian. Is that how it's used? Absolutely. Or it's used really early on when they say, okay, this young person has a disability, they have a developmental disability, and so they just need help. I mean, that's how it is. They just need help. And we can see, we look at Daniel, whose resume far exceeds mine and growing every year. I need far more help than Daniel does, right? So it's, again, not allowing the system to broad brush and paint these students as one size fits all.
You know, this section of identifying your legal rights, forget the videotapes.
No, you could have had the mic there. You could have sat there with the mic.
Oh, okay, I just wanted to show you my beautiful face without eyeglasses. Right? I just got the cataracts fixed. That's right. But it's a dear section to us because when we were doing the restoration part of this work, we had to scare up for our workshops and a bunch of people with disabilities who were under guardianship and were interested in having some of their restrictions removed, some of their rights restored. And we started, they came to the hotel, and we had a great time, and we learned a lot from them. But one of the things we learned from them was we asked the person under guardian, the person with disability, we said, what's your legal status? Do you have a guardian? Do you have this? Do you have guardian advocacy? What do you have? They don't know, nor do their parents.
Their parents don't know. They say, of course, I'm their guardian, I'm their parent. And I said, which one is your child? They said, he's over there, he's 45. Right? I'm their guardian, I'm their mom. So we started asking people, do you have a court-appointed guardian? And this court-appointed guardian, what's that? Do you have a power of attorney? And if not, how are you guys making decisions? Like, oh, well, she just lets me go. Okay, that's great. She lets me go with her to the doctor's appointments. She wants me to go with her, so I go. So it's looking at each of the unique situations and assessing it. So then we get into the people who had the rights, and we ended up just kind of going table by table and assigning different rights. So who's brave enough to start with one of the right sections? Which right did you guys look at?
We were right to marry, which was really funny because I'm getting married in December.
Oh, congratulations! You'll be so happy when it's there.
I can do a lot of this, really. I'm going to take it home. But we talked about how we really liked the resources in each section. There was websites or phone numbers or things that, you could maybe do in the classroom, like budgeting for the wedding and knowing how to affect your health insurance and things like that. And some of the things we might not do necessarily in the classroom.
Right.
Because it got into some stuff that might not be appropriate for all the students, but
Sure.
at least having that knowledge to give to a parent if they're like, oh, we have some concerns, they just started dating somebody.
Sure.
And suggestions, it was pretty easy to just hand this over and go, oh, we'll try this, and had good guiding questions and stuff.
That's great. I'm glad that was your takeaway from it. The sex education talk in the disability community is really complicated. It's complicated enough in the non-disability community, but put it in the disability community where there's universally a fundamental belief that we shouldn't talk about it at all, is what puts a lot of the people at risk. And so we wanted to make sure to include that, but we wanted to give it as a resource. There's a lot of different resources out there to assist with talking about sex education and sexual abuse. Yes.
Really quick, me and Abby just taught sex education to our 18 to 22-year-olds, and it was called Positive Prevention Plus, and it was made in California, and it's a comprehensive sex education unit. So, of course, it starts by saying abstinence is the only 100% effective way, but then we still went into birth control and condom use. So if you want to ask us any questions about this curriculum, please come up and ask, because it was so I was telling Anna, because with the Right to Marry, when my students heard that, when you guys came, I had some girls that were like, yeah, and their mom's sitting there, and the mom's like, wait. So we kind of decided that sex education was a really important thing, and all my students are 18, and most of them are their own guardians, so they were given the choice to opt out if they felt necessary. And I had a young lady come into my office, and she said, well, I'm going to opt out because my boyfriend is in a wheelchair, so he can't get me pregnant. And I was like, well, let's have a meeting about this maybe. So I can't stress enough how beneficial it was for my students. And this curriculum was tailored specifically for young adults with disabilities. So it came with activities, it came with the PowerPoint slides, it came with materials. So please come up and ask, and we will give you the information. And they have a great website where you can preview the curriculum before your district purchases it.
And the Department of Education trained us, so I think depending on what district you're in, they might be able to provide some materials, right? Maybe.
Right, yeah, I would just contact Department of Ed, because that's who we did it through. We requested it, and they went out and they found a curriculum for us. So I would ask around for that, but it was great.
That's exciting.
What was the name again?
Positive Prevention Plus.
Fantastic. See, that's why I love these things, because we all get together, and we've never heard of that either. We were out there looking, and truthfully, while self-advocacy is a huge focus in the disability community, when we were looking at doing the self-advocacy piece, we had a really hard time finding stuff. The abuse, neglect, and exploitation piece specific for disabilities, we had a really hard time finding stuff. And we know that it might be sprinkled out there in different states or maybe in different curriculums. So that's why it's so exciting to have all of you all in the same room, because these are all new materials for most of our group. So which was the next table? You'll go next?
Because we'll come down this side.
We had the voting, so I think what some of our takeaways, we definitely liked filling out how they regain their rights if it was taken away. Something that and as an educator, and I never realized, I was uneducated about that they could ask for accommodations. And then it went into, well, what kind of accommodations? Who's going to provide those? And you had a lovely the web links that we could go to so we could see. Because we're like, some of our students can be easily manipulated.
Sure.
Or influenced.
Sure.
Based on, we had that conversation, my son's in 7th grade. He's, that's what they learned about. And we said, he came to me asking me about, what do you believe in? And we had that engaging conversation. well, I want you to do your research first.
Right.
I want you to get your views, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss it as equals on that. Because I wanted him to build his own belief system. So we thought that that was really interesting. Another thing that we were saying that you can't, that's not a right that you could give to someone else.
Right.
Like you said, because the implications of, let's see, they may have passed away, but I've got 2 votes now.
That's
Yay.
right.
So those are some of the interesting things and the questions and the guiding principles back for them and how to earn their rights back.
That's great, and I'm glad that you took that away from it. My mom, Dr. Milton here's wife, is a lobbyist, Health and Human Service lobbyist, so I think until I was like 28, who knows, she just filled out the sample ballot for me. I remember when we sat with the group and we were working on this, she fills a sample ballot out for me, and I walk over to the booth and I plug those things in, right? Which is our right to do, but getting educated and learning all of what you're voting for and the people that you're voting for, it's always been kind of one of those hot topics in guardianship. Why would you take away someone's right to vote? Because you technically can't vote wrong. I guess depends who you ask. you can't vote wrong. That one in employment, let me tell you, it comes up all the time. And we've asked around, why would you ever remove someone's right to employment? And the answer is, well, maybe the employer is the exploiter, maybe there's some questionable things. But removing the right to retain employment, removing the right to vote, you then have to be able to show why you can do it. And I think, Karen, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, you did go through the restoration process with someone who wanted to vote, didn't you? Yes. So went through the whole restoration proceedings from a guardianship.
Well, it was the guardianship proceeding. A person was being adjudicated incapacitated. That's my story. This is like the worst thing, I thought. So here this man is in the courtroom, and he's about to have his rights taken away, all of his rights taken away. And I look over, and he has a I voted sticker, which meant he went that day, cast his vote, in the afternoon, he's about to have his right removed to vote. So, and I was a bystander. I was not an attorney representing either side, but I had to raise my hand and go, excuse me, we probably shouldn't remove his right to vote, because he proved today that he could get to the polls, cast his vote, because they don't just give those stickers out. So, yeah, right to vote. And there was a judge in Tallahassee, at one point, we rotate judges, she wouldn't remove anybody's right to vote. So you could be comatose and she'd let you keep your right to vote.
Yeah. So
there are all kinds of extremes, but that's one where, generally speaking, if they're in your classroom, they should keep the right to vote.
And I met a judge who said the same thing about employment, said, I don't care if the person is in a persistent vegetative state, maybe someone wants to come in and take pictures of their bedroom and then cut that person's a check for $800, I'm not going to take away their right to employment. As if it ever needs to happen, we will, but I'm not going to start with it. So even guardianship is reforming, but for every story that we hear about restoration, we can tell you 2,000 about times when it was really inappropriately used. So I'm glad that you all are finding these materials useful for discussing these with your students and with families and the parents. So what was the next group? I know we had a medical group. Yes.
What if a legal guardian dies?
That's a good question. What if a legal guardian dies?
Yes.
So so you're talking about the person is over the age of 18?
Yes. And the legal guardian died. And now he is, he was declared incompetent long time ago. And that's why problem, because I have two, that the legal guardian, and didn't put anybody who's going to be next of kin to replace that. Are we able to restore the rights of this individual?
So typically, and Karen, feel free to jump in. So it is best practice in guardianship for you to identify someone to take over your cases should you get hit by a bus, should you decide, should something happen to you that you are rendered incapacitated, we see that it's not often done. And this is another reason that we're so cautionary about using guardianship for people if there's something else available, because if something happens to your guardian, and we had this happen, that a guardian decided today, I'm going to retire. I'm retiring today. And she had a 60-person caseload, and she got on a cruise. And the judge said if she enters back into this community, I'm going to arrest her. I'm going to hold her in, because she just said, I'm going to walk away. And she was appointed on that you're appointed on those cases by a judge. And if something happens to the guardian, then that person is still incapacitated. They just don't have someone delegated to make the decision. So they sit in this in-between area where they can't make the decision, but no one else can do it either. So in that situation, the court is supposed to appoint somebody else to serve as the guardian. I just want to let you all know, in terms of restoration, and in the books we go into it a lot more in depth, but people can ask to look at the status of their guardianship at any time, and anybody can ask. So the person who's under the guardianship can say, hey judge, I want somebody to look at this because I think that this is I don't think I need a guardian. And they can do that, and we have seen it, that the second that they do that, and if the judge says, you know what, I think maybe we need to keep this in place for a little bit longer, the person goes, okay, and they go back to their house and they write another letter to the judge and they go, I think that I should not have a guardian. And it starts that process over again. They have that right to ask for that guardianship to be evaluated, but anybody can ask for that. So to your point, if that's something that has happened, the court is supposed to appoint somebody in that situation. Yes.
I would just add too that right now, except for guardian advocacy, every guardian has to be represented by an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
So the guardian who passed away has a lawyer, and if you I don't have to yell. And so what you can do is contact the court and say, this person's out here without a guardian, or if you can find out who the guardian's attorney was. Well, actually, the guardian's attorney should know that the person died and alerted the court.
Right.
Yes.
The guardianship was established down south, right in Miami area, and the person moved to Polk County.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
I would let she told me to repeat the comment you made was to clarify, is that in the example you gave, the person under guardianship moved to Polk County, but the guardianship was established in Miami. Now, I also agree too, because the way you phrased the question was, can the rights be restored? So it sounds like the person's operating just fine without a guardian, and it is true. You'd have to somehow go into the Miami guardianship court, and if you're from Miami, God bless you. That's not an easy thing to do, but it is the Miami guardianship court that's got to decide whether to appoint a new guardian or to give that person his or her rights back. You know what I would tell you to do? I would call Disability Rights Florida, or I would call the local legal aid organization in your area, because I think the individual, the person under guardianship, has this order, which is good in the state of Florida, and it needs to be cleared up. Mm-hmm. So legally, I would just get them some legal counsel.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, Daniel.
So, what would happen if something happens to the guardian and the person that is disabled is 18? Should that be a part of the support team, or like what would happen to the guardian if that guardian is not there?
Mm-hmm.
Then what should the 18-year-old disabled person would do by themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think first and foremost, your guardian should absolutely, if you have one, or if any of your students have one, should absolutely be part of that support team and should be involved in making those decisions with you. alongside you. But if that guardian is not there and not involved, you can at any point in time question the quality of that service provider. A guardian is a service provider, like a supported living coach, like any other, like a companion. They are a service provider, and they are an extension of that cord. And at any time, despite the fact that you might not be able to choose your guardian directly, you can question what they're doing. And you can question the level of care that they're providing. And if they happen to be a professional guardian, there's a man back there who's in charge of looking at every single time that someone questions whether or not what a professional guardian is doing is legal and ethical and falls within the standards of the law. Mike, you want to raise your hand back there? He's an attorney, and his role with our agency is to investigate professional guardians who are being accused of not doing what they're supposed to do. And we have a hotline, and I just want to clarify, while we don't oversee family guardians, if you know of a situation in which there is a family guardian appointed and you have questions about whether or not they're being abusive, neglecting, or exploiting, you can still call us and we can help through that. Yes.
So, what would happen if a cop approaches someone with a disability, and that person with a disability, age 18, doesn't really know what to say to the cop, and like say, like, I have this disability. Could you talk to me as someone with a disability? Like if the parent should have some card that would say their child with a disability and how the cop would interact with someone like that.
I think it's a genius idea, and I know that we're going slightly over time, but I want to, for those of you all, did everyone hear what his question was? As if in a situation where law enforcement needs to talk to or stop somebody who's an adult who has a disability, and they may need assistance in communication, or really the key is that the law enforcement needs to be educated on how to work with people with disabilities. Yes, absolutely.
Good. I'm glad Daniel brought that up. This is something that we've been talking about. I work with some adults in Special Olympics, and we're out and about in the community, and sometimes people misperceive a behavior as threatening when it's really not. It's simply a manifestation of a disability. And so we've been thinking and talking, and it's just in the planning stage now, to have some of our local law enforcement do a training with our athletes. And after that training, maybe we're still thinking, and you think about it too, to get a card that says, I've been through this special training, and I'm a not police auxiliary, but I'm trained. And by simply showing that card, then the law enforcement officer should go, oh, okay, that card communicates more to the officer than just I've been through that training, but I know, okay, I recognize, I see, what you're doing.
Absolutely. I know that we have a question in the back as well. And this is super important because, as you all have seen, the lack of understanding out in the community leads a lot of times for people with developmental disabilities to get Baker Acted, which is for mental health, because they have behaviors, is what we hear. Law enforcement gets called and they think that this person has behaviors, and so the very first thing that they do is they Baker Act, which is not appropriate a lot of the time. So it's a fantastic project. I'd love to be kept in the loop for what you all are doing. Yeah, that's great. I know we had a question back there.
If you use the N2I unique curriculum inside like resources or somewhere hidden inside there, they actually have a form you can print off, fill out, and carry with you that says your name, that you have a disability, who they should contact, triggers, reinforcements, it's all on this one page.
Wonderful. And what was the name of that?
It's inside the unique curriculum from N2Y.
Okay.
They worked with somebody, an autism group, and created it.
That's great. Can we, and what we'll do is maybe during the break, I'll have you come up and write down the name on the board so that people, because I'm not exactly sure if I could spell that. we'll have you write on the board so that people can look into it. And I know, Vicky's giving me the hard cutoff line, so all you medical people who got to look at the medical section, if you want to come and talk to us about it, that'd be great. But you're off the hook for putting you on the spot. So thank you all so much. I'm glad that you got to interact with the materials. We're going to take a 10-minute break.